Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator for the Undergraduate Research Initiative here at the University of Saskatchewan. And one of the programs that I run is called SURE, Student Undergraduate Research Experience. And through that program, we do a lot of work with supporting students to develop research skills in all kinds of different areas, including communication. In fact, that might even be our largest basket. So with that in mind, we knew that one of our areas that we all needed a little bit more help and work is about how we take our data and share it and tell stories with it. And so we've invited Michelle Boulton, who is the lead at 3C Publications, to come, and she's actually going to be presenting a two-part series. So today is about storytelling with data and sort of that larger picture view of what we need to think about when we want to take our data and tell stories with it. And so Michelle will walk us through that today. But next Wednesday, she'll be back to give us sort of that makeover 101, how to make your charts and graphs and data look better. So be sure to join us for both of those events if you can. We are recording them and they will also be posted on our YouTube site. And with that, I'm going to be quiet and turn it directly over to Michelle, who's ready to give you guys some interesting information. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us today.
Thank you, Merle, for inviting me. As you mentioned, this is a two-part series for me. The second part that we're going to see next week is actually an older presentation that I've done for a number of years. And this first part is something new that I've added. And it comes from my work where I've had people sending me charts and graphs and they have expectations about what they want it to look like. And it occurred to me that really, before we get down to telling people how to make their charts and graphs look better, we should be asking questions about what chart should I be using? What story do I want to be telling? How can I use my charts and graphs more effectively in the context of usually a larger document, right? Or a larger piece of content. And so this is the first time I've done this presentation. It's a beta, you're my first audience. And we're still working out some kinks, so bear with me on this one. And so before I get going, I should also tell you a little bit about who I am. Before this session started, you talked about being a historian, and so data and charts were not really your thing. I have an English degree. And my intention when I was in university 100 years ago at the U of S was to be a journalist. And so I did not imagine that data visualization and design were going to be things that were important to me. I went out into the world, I started working with communication, and it was something that really fascinated me because it was an aspect of communication that was really an important way to add and accentuate what we're talking about. So I just started learning and reading, and so this has become something that is now a really big part of the work that I do. I work a lot with academics. I work a lot with reports, technical information. Specifically, I call myself a clear communication specialist because I help people take complex information and translate that into something that's easy for all of us to access, to use, to understand. So that's really where I'm coming from. And so with that, I'm going to get started with my presentation. I also want to mention Sydney is following the chat. Generally, when I'm presenting, I prefer to do it in person and have people in the room asking questions, putting their hands up. So I really would rather have a bit of a dialogue. So if you have a question, please pop it in the chat. Sydney's watching and she might either repeat the question or call on you to unmute yourself and participate in the presentation by providing your questions, your insights, that sort of thing. Something I've learned long ago is that I'm never, the most experienced person in the room. Everybody comes to these presentations with some understanding or some experience. So feel free to pop in and contribute or ask a question. So typically, if we were in a room together, I would ask you to give me a show of hands if you had ever used or had to use data displays in your work or your research. Given the nature of this presentation, I'm quite confident everybody in the room would put their hand up. And then I would ask you how many of you have had to create charts and graphs as part of your research or your academic work. And probably fewer hands might go up. People like Merle and I, when we were at school, certainly were not creating charts as part of our academic work. And so here's just a little bit of advice to help us all kind of get a better understanding of what purpose they serve and how to use them better.
We've got some hands up of people saying, yes, I've had to make charts before.
Absolutely. Like I say, given this particular group as a focused on student undergraduate research, I'm that a lot of you researchers are, of course, using data to create charts and graphs. So hopefully I can give you a little insight today into how to use them more effectively. So the first thing I want to talk about is our human brain. We are all really oddly still largely controlled by that kind of ancient brain that our ancestors were given, right? A lot of how we perceive and process information can really be traced back to how our caveman ancestors made their way about in the world. And so even today, we have 5 senses, but most of them, the most important one is sight. In fact, 70% of our sensory receptors are in our eyes. 70%, that's huge, right? We have more neurons dedicated to vision than to all of the other 4 senses combined. So this is a really important aspect of how we process information. When our eyes are open, vision accounts for 2/3 of the electrical activity in our brain. And here's the thing. When we see an image, it's processed in that visual part of our brain that is so active and has all these neurons and is really super fast. When we read text, that's not something our ancestors ever knew how to do, right? This is something that we've created. We created written language, we created words, we created writing and reading. So this is learned behavior. Our brains aren't nearly as quick at processing text as they are at processing images. So that's why we see a lot of this kind of thing out in the world when we want to communicate universally to all kinds of people with all kinds of different backgrounds and levels of education and cultural understandings. We often use visuals and icons. Is there anybody who doesn't know what these symbols might mean if you saw them on a door at a restaurant or in public, right? They're ubiquitous. Everybody pretty much all over the world would see one of these icons and understand, oh, this is where I need to go right now. So that's also why, for example, we use icons and visuals for things like warning labels. We've seen all of these in places where people need to immediately and without question understand this is a hazard. This is dangerous for us for one reason or another. Just imagine, for example, if this was how we had to warn someone that this thing they're about to spill might actually, corrode their skin or could be toxic to them. So now I want to try an experiment with you. I'm going to give you a word, and I'd like you to pop into the chat what you see when I say this. I'm going to give you the word apple. What are people thinking when I give them the word apple? I'm going to guess that not one of you saw the letters A-P-P-L-E in your mind if I gave you the word apple, right? That's just not instinctive for us. That's not the thing that our brain immediately goes to. Instead, we're going to see an apple. We're going to visualize an apple. In fact, we're going to be able to describe a very specific apple. You probably thought of maybe a red apple or a green apple. You could tell me about the shape. You could tell me about the color. You could probably even imagine the texture of it. But nobody, when you say a word, will immediately think of the spelled out thing in our minds. That's just another indicator of how quickly or how instinctively visuals are for our brains to process. Processing print isn't something the human brain was built for. It's something we've learned to do because it's obviously a very important way for us to communicate, especially in the digital age, right? Text is everywhere. We need to be able to read and communicate with text, but it's not something that we do really efficiently. In fact, our brain can process 36,000 visual messages per hour, 36,000, as opposed to 15,000 words, which is what the typical human can read in an hour. So clearly, the visual is important. And like I say, I'm a word person, so words are also really important, but I also understand that oftentimes putting those two together is really the most effective way to communicate. If we can combine words, which can often provide, specifics and clarity where the visuals might be a little bit ambiguous, but use the visuals as something that catches attention, that draws the reader in, that helps to give an example or illustrate what we're talking about. So, in our content, and today we're talking about data and charts and graphs, especially in the age of the internet. Visuals and data visualizations are everywhere. They're all over social media. They're all over the billboards, the signs out in the world. They're on everything we see because they work. That's why they're so common. And sometimes people think that they're not something that they can use in their work or their everyday communication. But I'm hoping that by the end of the day, we have a better feeling for our ability to put these things to work for us. I want to start with an example, and this is a bit of an older example. It was developed by a young woman named Stefania Passera, and she is brilliant. If you want to look her up on LinkedIn or social media, she studied at the Aalto University in Finland, and her area of expertise is contract communication. And so she takes something really dense and boring and often inscrutable like contract information and communicates it in a way that is easier to understand, quicker to process, and just generally a better way to communicate. So here's an example that she had put out quite some time ago. She took a very typical piece of a contract. It's about payment terms. It's quite dense. A lot of people are going to skim it at best. They might pick up on some of the numbers because they're more visual in the text, but really it's not very engaging or inviting. So instead, Stefania offered us this. It's incredibly visual. It's incredibly easy to read. It's so succinct. It's very clear. And so again, to some people, this looks like, this is beyond me. This is really more than I can do with my information. But when you really look at what's going on here, it's a very simple table, really. We've got the arrows, which are a bit graphical, but otherwise, really what we've got going on is a very, very simple visualization. She's taken the preconditions and put them in the first column. And then she's put, what's next? Invoice. What happens? Within 60 days, a payment will come. And here's how much the payment will be. So all of this information that was in that really dense slide that I showed you earlier is here, but it's really easy to understand. It's clear, it's visual, it's engaging. The colors are giving keys that all these things all go together. And again, this is something that most of us could do really easily. Even if you didn't get around to adding the fancy arrow pointing, people would still read instinctively from left to right. So it could work for you.
Could you type out Stefania's name in the chat so that people can look her up afterwards?
I could, but I can't seem to access my chat. Hold on.
Or just say it again, and I'll put links.
Okay.
Stefania, last name is Passera, you said?
Passera. So Stefania. Passera, P-A-S-S-E-R-A.
Perfect. I'll go search and I'll put a link in the chat.
Great. Yeah, no, she's amazing. I discovered her when she was working on her PhD thesis, and she's out in the world now and putting out some amazing work. And she's really generous about sharing what she's learned. And so check her out. I'm a big fan. So now here's a quote from Edward Tufte. And if you have done any reading at all about data visualization, you likely will have come across Mr. Tufte and Mr. Tufte's ideas. He's really considered one of the kind of foremost thinkers about data design in modern context. And he's somebody that I'm a big fan of. So he pops up a lot in my discussions about data visualization. And so Mr. Tufte says, often the most effective way to describe, explore, and summarize a set of numbers, even a very large set of numbers, is to look at the pictures of those numbers. So what he's talking about really, right, is turning our numbers into tables, charts, and graphs. And when you sit down with your data set and you're trying to figure out how to communicate that information in a chart, there's really two stages. And the first one is the discovery stage. And that's usually the part that you do all on your own. That's when you're playing with the data, you're rearranging the data, you're doing all kinds of fun stuff, and you're just exploring. You might try different charts, you might try different groupings of numbers, you might try, reversing what information you put on which axes. There's all kinds of things that you can do at this stage. But as you're doing it, what you're trying to see is the story that often will emerge at this discovery stage, right? When you put your data into a chart, that's often where it's much easier to see a change over time, parts of a whole, how the data is distributed. It's a great way to compare values. It's hard to compare values in a table, right? Because you've got all these numbers and our little brains can only hold on to so much information at one time. But when you throw it out there in a chart and it's visual, you can see, oh, this is much bigger than this one. Or maybe even differently, why is this number kind of this outlier? What's happening there? Is this the story I want to be looking at? You're looking at the relationship between the different variables, and all of this will start to emerge in that discovery stage. So I strongly urge you to spend some time and just explore at that stage. There's lots of different software out there to put our data in to start exploring and making charts. I'm not going to get into specifics of which one you should use, but just explore. Be explorers, go out there and discover. Oftentimes, like I say, you won't necessarily see the trends or the relationships until you make them visual. When you get to the presentation stage, however, that's where you're really now focusing on your reader or the intended audience for your charts. So that's more what we're going to talk about next week, right? Is how to present things really clearly. Today, we're going to talk about really kind of basic things like which chart should I be looking at? And next week, we'll talk about how to make those charts the easiest for your readers to understand. I am going to quickly go through some of the different charts, what they're good for, some of the things to be careful of. Again, if you have questions at this point, feel free to put your hand up or alert Sydney that you have a question, and we'll go from there. So the bar chart, the ubiquitous bar chart, it's everywhere. It's one of the most commonly used charts. And there's good reason for that. It's easy to design. It's straightforward to use and read. We can understand that on the bottom, we have a set of values, whether that's, a set of categories, whether that's years or, it could be coats, t-shirts, and crop tops or whatever. It could be anything. We usually have the value scale on the vertical axes. They're intuitive. Most of us see them all the time. So we just kind of rather instinctively understand. And even if we don't, our brains are really quickly able to pick up what the bar chart's trying to say. They're very good for showing, comparing values between groups, good for showing change over time, and they're really good for showing parts of a whole.
Is there anything you'd say a bar chart is not good for? Or
that's a good question. I'll have to give that some thought. Instinctively, I'm going to say not necessarily, because they're kind of the fallback, and they're also kind of the basis for some of the other more elaborate charts that we're going to talk about. So for example, the next one we're going to talk about is a pie chart. Well, really a pie chart, I guess we can move on. The pie chart is really basically the same information as a bar chart. It's a circle, and it's divided into parts, and each part represents a proportion of the whole. So the same data can go into a bar chart or a pie chart, except that our brains are really much better at processing the bar chart than the pie chart. We're not good at figuring out the difference in proportional size. This is not something that our brains just instinctively understand generally. So especially if the pie wedges are kind of similar in size, it's really, really hard for our brain to quickly kind of ferret out which is bigger. There are things we can do to help make pie charts better, which we'll talk about next week. But generally speaking, they're not the most effective way to, again, do the same things, compare basically parts to a whole. So right off the top of my head, I mean, I suppose there are very specific specialized things that a bar chart isn't good for, but it's kind of the fallback that's really good for most things. One of the things that our brains do really well, for example, is, can you guys see my cursor if I'm moving it around?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So our brains can easily see the tops. We can figure out what the numbers are, but also it's easy for our brains to process the difference between the length of the bars. This is something our brains can process very quickly. So we're good at it. And so that makes bar charts really good for us as readers. Whereas, like I say, we talked about the pie chart, which is not as easy for the brain to process. Now, a variation on the pie chart is the donut chart. It's really just a pie chart with a hole in the middle. One of the things that is maybe a little easier for the donut chart is now we've got these basically bar charts twisted into a circle. So that's a little easier for our brain to see. However, again, the bar chart is just going to be more effective because we're still trying to decipher. We've got these weird bars on an angle. So it just takes a little bit more cognitive load, a little more brain power for us to decipher what the pie chart is telling us. And again, it gets really hard if we have wedges that are really close to the same size, or worse yet, too many wedges. How many times have we seen that, where there's just way too many wedges and it's hard to figure out what's going on in a pie chart. Generally speaking, a rule of thumb is about 4 or 5 at the most before it becomes too much. So a variation on the bar chart is the stacked bar chart. And this can be really helpful if you want to put more than one group of things into your chart. Maybe we're not just looking at one aspect of our data. We want to look at 2 different things. How many, t-shirts and shorts did we sell in 2018? So now we can put those things together and we stack the 2 values up one on top of the other. And so we can see the total sales, let's say, if that's what this was about. And then we can also see the component parts. So it adds an extra layer of information into the chart. One of the problems with the stacked bar chart, of course, is that, again, because the bottom ones are lined up, so they're really easy for us to figure out the difference between them, so we can see where the tops of those are compared to the other ones. Once we get into the second or third row, if that's what we've added, it gets harder for our brains to process this because we have to figure out, is this the same as this, or is one of them slightly smaller? we can do it usually, but it takes some time to think about it and ponder it. So it's slower to process, a little harder for our brains to access the information. So a better way to approach that might be a grouped bar chart. So now we can have the same information as the stacked bar, except we unstack them, right? So now we're putting our different components still in groups, but side by side. And we've color coded them so that we know that, you know, all of the lightest ones are one category, all of the medium colored ones are another category. And we can play with this, right? When we talked about the discovery stage, here's a really good time where we can look at what are we going to group together, and what are we trying to compare, and how we make those groupings is going to affect the story we tell with our visualization, right? So that's something to play with at that discovery stage and see what you come up with and see, does this support the story I'm trying to tell? So here's an example of that. And I would have recreated this for the presentation, but I ran out of time. So instead I've pulled a chart that was sent to me for a job I was working on recently. So one of my clients is an academic journal called Summer Academe. And what it is a journal, an academic journal specifically focused on summer session. And so if you are of a certain age, like Merle and I, you might remember when the University of Saskatchewan used to have a printed course calendar that, you know, was put out in the mail or that was available on campus, and it had all kinds of information in it. Now all of that is online. This particular university, which submitted this paper into the journal I was working on, was looking at, they still have a printed calendar for their summer session. And they were exploring whether or not it was still a valuable thing to print, or if they should distribute this information in some other way. So this was part of their research. And what they were looking at was the different components of their printed calendar, you know, the course descriptions, the actual calendar, the deadlines for applying and all of that, information about their campus. And then there was, sorry, people who didn't use the printed calendar at all. And what they wanted to do was look at students who had either no credits, who'd never taken a summer session class, had taken 1 to 6 credits in summer, or 7 or more. And when I looked at this, I thought, well, that's an interesting way to look at the information. But I wasn't entirely confident that that was communicating what they were trying to say in the paper itself. So this is actually what got printed in the journal. And so what I did is I flipped the table, the chart on its head a little bit. And instead of focusing on how many credits the students had taken, I was looking at what aspects or components of the printed calendar they used, and then looked at number of credits they'd taken. So for example, now, actually, no, I'm gonna ask you, who can tell me what the main thrust of this chart would be? Like, what would be the main takeaway? What's the main thing that's being communicated in this chart? Sydney can let me know if somebody pops this into the chat, or if nobody does, I'll put you on the hot spot and make you answer my question.
My guess would be like looking at it, and maybe this is from the perspective of a student who does a lot of reading of articles, but I would look at that and say, okay, well, it looks like the people who use stuff the most have taken like 1 to 6 credits. So that would be my takeaway.
I would agree. What do you
Brianne
think?
in the chat said that she thinks that people only really use it for courses. Someone else said, I'm focused more on the 1 to 6 credit experience. It's better at utilizing the printed schedule. Merle says it's more about who's using the printed services.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's the same data, and none of this is wrong, right? There's no right or wrong answers here. But depending on how we create our chart, it tells a very different story, because this one now is about which components get the most use, right? What are people using the calendar for? The data about the credits is still there, but it's not the most important thing. It's not the primary thing that people notice about the chart, right? So again, that discovery stage, that exploring stage is really important. And then not just thinking about, does this communicate something, but is it communicating what I want it to tell? Because that's what's going to influence the story you're telling, right? So here's another variation on the stacked bar chart. I'm not a big fan of the stacked bar, but this is something I do use a little more often in my work. And what this is 100% stacked bar. And what this does is it actually shows proportions. So it's very much like our pie chart, except it's in bar chart form, which of course we've already established that I'm not a big fan of pie charts. So you can see why this now is something that I would prefer. So what this means is, regardless of how many responses or units we're counting, we give them all a 100% value and show a proportionate portion of the value in our stacked bar chart. So what we're seeing is how the items are distributed. Again, it's not that easy to decipher the individual units. The information is there. It's much easier to see the stuff coming from the top and the bottom. But if you have more than 2 or 3, it can get really hard to compare the individual components of your chart. So I would usually advise you to look at the grouped bar rather than the stacked bar for this kind of communication.
I see how something like this could also be helpful if, like in your previous example, there were a lot of students who had taken 1 to 6 credits, but not a lot who'd taken 7. So
Yes.
Expressing it as a percent would maybe help get rid of that skew where it looks like not a lot of people used it, but it's just because there were fewer responses.
Exactly. Very good point, Sydney. So here's another, very probably, actually all of the charts I'm talking about today are really, really common, right? That's why I'm dealing with them. I'm a communication person. These are things that are used to communicate a lot. And so those are the charts that I'm talking about. But a line chart is very, very common. It's most effective to show change over time, right? It's sort of like your timeline. What we've got is usually some number at the bottom. Dates or time is very common, but it can be other things, right? Like maybe we're going to communicate how many accidents there are on the freeway based on kilometers traveled. And so we could put, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, or whatever along the bottom. And that's going to be our marker. And our point is going to go at how many accidents are there for people who've traveled 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers. So again, it's a variation, but it's basically about change over a span. Again, a variation on the line chart is the area chart. I'm not really sure how these might be perceived as better than the line chart. Basically, all it is the line chart with the area filled in from the top of the chart down to the baseline. So I guess if you're trying to show, I don't know. Like I say, area charts are not something that I understand the value of very much. They're not something I use very often. I'm going to give you
I've
an
used them
example.
occasionally in like hydrology situations where you're showing like level of water or something like that. So it kind of looks like the height of the water, but I think that's almost more of a coincidence than anything else.
Yeah, because I mean, the line at the top doesn't change, right? You just fill in the space between the line and the base. So if you're using one line or one measurement, then I guess this is not so bad. We get into a little more trouble if we have a grouped line chart, right? So basically now we've got multiple things that we're measuring all along the same scale, and we've put them into our grouped line chart. Again, next week, we'll talk about some ways to make them more and less difficult to read. Generally speaking, much like some of the other charts we've talked about, less is more. If you have too many lines in your line charts, they can get to be a real snarl, basically. They look like, a big tangle of lines that are really hard to follow. 3 to 5 might be kind of the top end for how many lines you should have, and even 5 is starting to push it. And so if we're going to make a stacked area chart with more than one line, this is what it might look like. There's a couple of different ways you can do a stacked chart. They can either be kind of layered one in front of the other, in which case what you have is basically the exact values, one chart in front of the other. Or you can stack the charts one on top of the other, like our stacked bars, which then adds to the value each time. Those are a little harder to ferret out, but again, it's about, I guess, then showing your total values. But again, I would always defer in this position to a bar chart again, because they're just so much easier to understand and interpret than this area chart. And I want to give you an example. Again, this is on a project I was working on fairly recently, and they wanted to do one of these stacked area charts. And we ran into a little problem. Can anyone see where we had a problem with this one? So here it is, right? We would be fine.
Dan in the chat said in September.
Yeah, exactly. So ideally what would happen is all of these numbers would be getting higher, so that we could easily see where one chart, one category that we were measuring stopped and the other one started. But in September, we had a problem because the line for, oh, and I see that we have a color problem. Sorry about this, beta, remember. This was actually Fond du Lac, and their numbers actually dipped below Uranium Cities for this 1 month only. So this was the compromise that we came up with to resolve that. The other thing that I would point out is that poor old Stony Rapids is almost invisible at the bottom, right? Like it's there, but it's so small that it's very hard to see compared to, for example, Black Lake. So that's something to keep in mind of as well. When you're comparing these huge disparities of numbers, sometimes the little guy gets really lost in the chart. And so sometimes it's better to maybe use a different chart, or even something else altogether. Sometimes what you really need is just a table. So here's another more complex chart that is quite common, and it's this combined line and bar charts, right? So what we've done is we've combined two different charts, and it's a nice way to compare different sets of information in one chart. So in many ways, it can serve a certain purpose. One of the problems with these things when you have them superimposed on top of each other, however, is that we have these different axes, right? We've got one on the right and one on the left. And the data inside corresponds to different vertical axes or values. And that can be really confusing for your reader, like which one goes with which side. So labeling becomes incredibly important when you start superimposing graphs on top of each other. Generally speaking, they all share the same horizontal axes or information. So that helps, but it gets really hard to start comparing. So this is one of the ways which graphs really tell big pictures, right? So this isn't a way that you're going to easily provide detailed information to your readers. It's showing the big picture, the trends, the overall flow or distribution or change. So again, it's common. We see them a lot, but they are harder to read. So you should be aware of that when you're putting it out there in the world, that this might be something that might be more likely to be misunderstood by your readers, right? And of course, there's the scatter plot. And speaking of hard to read for most readers, scatter plots are not something that most people run into generally out in the world. They're not commonly used for communication with the general public. So a lot of people don't really understand how to read a scatter plot. It tends to be something that's more commonly used at the discovery stage of your data visualization journey or in the research stage. So this is something that if you are a scientific-based researcher, you're going to run into a lot of scatter plots, and you're probably going to understand how to read them, but they are a lot harder for your reader to understand. And so basically how they're working, right, is we've got, we're showing the relationship between two different variables, usually one running along the horizontal and one running along the vertical. And there we put a point where the two intersect. And so they're really, really good in that discovery stage for looking at the distribution of our data. And one of the things that they're good for example, is like, what is this one doing way over here? We've got this little outlier, what's going on? So they're very valuable in certain respects, but they're not something I would necessarily recommend for public consumption. This, however, is something that is very widely used for public consumption, and it's very easy to understand, generally speaking. Our gauge chart is basically showing us the performance of some metric, so we can see where the targets are along the arch. It looks like a speedometer or something that we're all really familiar with, and the needle points to where are we at in terms of meeting or attaining whatever this ultimate end measurement is, right? So it's used on a lot of reports showing business information, that sort of thing. They're popular in all kinds of other sorts of social media presentations. They have a definite value in certain respects. For example, achievement records. If you're showing, you know, how well is your division doing in terms of meeting your targets, a gauge chart like this can be a really quick and effective way to communicate that information. But like I mentioned earlier, sometimes what you really need is just a table. Tables are really simple. They're easy for us to understand. They're instinctive. Basically, much like the way we instinctively read, a table is read from top left, across to the right, back down. We read row by row. And so that's also an important distinction. We read tables, we see charts, but the part of our brain that accesses table information is the same part of our brain that reads text, whereas charts and graphs usually are processed by the part of our brain that processes visuals. And so they're slower for us to understand, but they do have certain important uses. So what are some of those uses? Let's say, you know, we talked about having really big numbers that we're comparing to really small numbers. Well, in a chart, the little guy gets lost entirely. But if you have a table, the data is there and your readers can see it. So there's no question about, you know, is there even, have you ever looked at a chart where you're not even sure, like, is there a value here? It looks like there's nothing. Or it's so small in a pie chart that you don't even see the wedge. So in those cases where you've got a real big disparity in the data that you're communicating, a table can be really valuable. Also, if your readers have to access the precise information, or maybe they'll be referencing it later, or, you know, like something like a budget where you might be going through numbers as a group. So there's a lot of ways in which tables can be really valuable. You can also put all kinds of different information together in a table in a way that you just can't in a chart. We talked about, you know, the superimposed line and bar chart and how that was struggling to work together. Well, with the table, you can have all kinds of different values here, and you can have different, you know, this could be a percentage, this could be a whole, this could be, you know, all kinds of stuff. You can put them together and it can be communicated really clearly, really easily, which is much harder to do with the chart.
It sounds kind of like charts are better for like trends and patterns, and tables are better for individual numbers and data points. So would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, and sorry, another one of the ways in which you may not want to put it, so when you may not want to have a table, is when you're, for example, doing a presentation like this one. I talked about how tables are read rather than seen or looked at. So what happens when you put a table up, especially if it's a more complex table, your audience is reading the table. And so instead of paying attention to you and what you're saying, they're busy reading the table and zoning out from the presentation. So unless you're going to stop and give them some time to go through and read the table, that's probably not your best choice for a presentation. And it's also not great, like Sydney just said, to point out or highlight patterns in your data, because it can be a lot harder to find than that's where your charts are really shining. So we can, however, combine some elements of charts and tables. And this is just one example where we've got our table, but then we've added a graph at the bottom, at the end. So we've got the graphical element, which is quick and easy, and we've got the table, which provides the precise details. Now, this is not a really, don't start looking at the numbers and expecting the chart to add up, because I literally just randomly plunked information in here and made some rectangles at the end. But it gives you kind of the idea of what that could look like. Another example could be like a heat map, where you would make some of the highest numbers darker and some of the lower numbers maybe less obvious. So very quickly before we wrap up, I just want to talk about some specialist charts that we don't see that often, but we do see a lot out in the world. So the first of those is something called Isotype, and it was invented by Otto Neurath back in the 1920s. And he had this idea that we could communicate, what he really wanted to do was communicate data to the average lay person, the general reader, the general audience, that they could easily understand. So he created a series of icons that represented values, right? You can see each symbol, each blue symbol represents 50 million people. Each black man represents 10,000 home weavers. So this was his invention. And it's a lot more complex than I'm getting into right now, actual isotype, but the idea of pictographs is very common. So here's an example from Presenting Numbers, Tables, and Charts, which is a book written by Sally Bigwood and Melissa Spohr. And so here they've used the icon of the ambulance, and it represents one ambulance per 100,000 people in Hallamshire or these other counties. So it's a very visual way to show how this, how the availability of ambulances per 100,000 people. It has some drawbacks, however. And what you can see here is in certain places, we can't be very precise because we don't have an even 100,000. So what this chart has done is tried cutting the ambulance in pieces, and that's not that effective. So generally, pictographs like this can be visual, but they're not very good, clear and effective communicators. So another way to approach that same thing is to scale our icons. So instead of having multiples, we have them in different sizes. The challenge with that, of course, is it's really hard for the brain to look at these and quickly try to figure out which one is bigger and by how much. So if we took a really close look at this, you can see that the data creators here obviously understood this. So they've embedded this little bar chart in their icon, which I thought was kind of cute. And we're kind of running out of time here. So I'm wondering, should we open up for questions before I go on to anything else?
Also, if anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And then if you have somewhere that you need to go at 12, we can probably keep the recording going and just answer the last of the questions.
Okay. So I have a few more slides. Should I keep going or should we just stop here?
Absolutely. You're doing great.
Okay. So Edward Tufte again, my boy says, above all else, show the data, right? And he's really on the minimalist side of data presentation thinking. And the other end of the spectrum is likely this guy, and his name is Nigel Holmes. And Nigel was creating charts for Time magazine beginning in the 1970s. And he was very visual. And of course, his communication was going out in this mass consumption publication, Time magazine. And so he was trying to create something that was going to really grab attention, that was going to convey the message, but also be memorable. And so he was really well known for this type of chart. He did a lot of them. The problem, however, with these kinds of things, of course, and what Edward Tufte would really get upset about is there's so much going on, and there's so much, for example, even the line here at the bottom has been skewed. Everything is kind of curved. It's hard to read the actual data. It's visual, it's attractive, it's memorable, but in terms of communicating the data, it's probably not the most effective way to do that. So here we have the same data pulled out and presented in much the same way. We've even left the rectangles empty so that they look more like the other chart. And now if we take a look at the two of them side by side, you can see that while the monstrous guy is really attractive and visual, the data itself is much easier to understand in a more simple and straightforward presentation. Of course, it depends on what you're trying to do. The more visual aspect is usually trying to persuade, to it tends to be more biased, right? They have definitely an ultimatum, or sorry, an objective in presenting the information. They want you to have an opinion after reading it. So from a paper by Bateman et al., there was a line in there that I thought was interesting. Memorability of a graph may be as or more important than interpretability. Depends on what you're trying to do, right? So I just have a couple more slides talking about how to highlight your key information without being quite so graphic. Here's a series of dots. And if I presented you this series of dots, there's nothing here. They're all the same size. They're all the same color. There's nothing here to draw the eye to one dot or the other. You might instinctively look at the one at the top left first, because that's where we start reading from. But other than that, there's really nothing here to distinguish any of these dots from each other. They're all the same distance apart. However, as soon as we introduce some color, so we pop the first one, it's a little bolder now. That's the first place we look. And so your brain is going to assume that that dot is more prominent for a reason. It's more important than the other ones. However, if we highlight a different dot, now that's where your eye goes first. That's now going to be the first place you look. And the reason why I'm showing you this is, for example, when you have your data presented, again, we've got all the same colored bars. It all kind of looks the same. We might start from the top and read down, but there's really not a lot to give us a sense of what is the most important element of this graph. We can, however, pop some color into it. And then that's exactly where the eye is going to go first, right? We're going to go see that, look at how many people thought this was an excellent presentation. But the other way to do that is you can also push the rest of the presentation to the background. So instead of adding color or emphasizing your key elements, another way to draw attention to them is to just push the other ones back, make them lighter, make them less prominent. So again, that's another way of making sure that your readers take from your graph that key bit of information that you actually want them to hear and see. And with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions people might have. How about I stop sharing the screen?
I always learn so much. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that. My video is a little slow, but I am physically here. I promise I'm coming back. In terms of, I'm curious to know, so you've given this, not this presentation, this is the first time giving this particular presentation, but what were some of the things that you must have been seeing? Because next week our Makeover 101 is a little bit more of that, how to make your stuff, really pop. But there clearly were things that people were missing. And one of the things that I got from today's session that I really appreciated was that to visualize your data really helps you to understand your data. It's not just about you telling the story to someone else, but you telling the story to yourself to work your way through it. So what have you seen in your work that's really made that key point really obvious to you?
Well, like I say, one of the things I commonly do, for example, is somebody will send me a chart that they want included in their report or their academic paper or something like that. And I'll look at it and I'm thinking to myself, you're not really highlighting what is reflected in your paper. Do you know what I'm saying? The data is there. They've picked a chart, they've put it there, but it's not the chart that's highlighting that element that they want to be talking about. So oftentimes it's about switching up the format or switching up. Sometimes it's even about reducing the information. Like another thing that happens a lot is we get charts that just have so much information in them, and half of it isn't even covered in the paper itself, but the researcher spent so much time and they gathered all this information and it's all really interesting and I have to tell everybody all this stuff, except that, you know, they get lost in this big complex chart. And really what's better served is focusing the reader on those key elements that really force what you're trying to say, as opposed to simply, you know, like sharing. Oftentimes we say this a lot in plain language and clear communication. It's not about what you want to tell your readers. It's about what they need or want to know, you know, so.
The audience needs to know, wants to know, that's for sure. There's a question that came in on the chat from Brianne. What programs are best for data visualization? She says, I know R is good. People in my lab use Eclipse, but I haven't tried it yet. I just want pretty graphs.
Good question. Actually, I'm not a very good person to answer that. You can make graphs and charts in so many different applications. Really what I can share with you is how to use those applications, whatever they are, to the best of your advantage. So I'm really not going to be the best person, to be honest with you. I do a lot of production in the Adobe Creative Suite. Again, I'm not a scientific researcher, I'm a communicator, but that's not usually how people make charts and graphs. So
can I share, like, sorry, Michelle's actually my mom, so I see her working on this stuff a lot. And often something that she does is like she takes a chart that might have been created in R, which I've used, or like Excel, but then you recreate it once the shape is there, you recreate it a little bit more plainly using something like Adobe or even something like Canva, as long as you're careful about what details are going in, to make it look pretty. So that's something you can do as well, is like use your software, whatever it's R, Excel, to create that shape that you're looking for, the chart, and then recreate it to make it look pretty in the way that you want, as long as it still matches the same visual look, I guess.
As long as the data points are still clear.
Exactly.
Yeah. And oftentimes a lot of these applications really don't give you a lot of control about how you present the information in the chart or what elements you can include or not include. And so I find them a bit challenging that way. But of course, I'm kind of a minimalist. So the first thing I want to do is take a chart that was created in Excel and I dump it into something else and I start stripping things out because I don't think they're important to the story that the chart is telling. So.
In terms of data visualization, do you ever find that, like, there's you talked about sort of how you can stack one on top of each other and how that kind of, you know, but do you find that sometimes you're working with people and you're actually saying, you know what, I know you want to put this all in one chart, but it's going to be better in 2 or even 3. Does that ever happen?
Absolutely. In fact, you know, we talked a little bit about line charts, for example, and when somebody will send me like 16 line graphs in one chart, and I'm like, there's not a hope, there's not enough colors in the world to help people understand all of this and follow it. So often what we do is create something called mini multiples, where you'll give a whole bunch of little charts that all are built exactly the same way, and you put them together side by side, and suddenly people can really easily see the differences and the trends in a way that they couldn't when you have them all stacked one on top of each other. So yes, parsing apart charts is often a big part of what I do.
I think that's brilliant. In terms of infographics, because you talked about that, and the one person that you referenced who sort of introduced a little bit of infographics and visuals in her legal work, and what are you seeing in terms of trends? Is that infographic trend that we see on social media or that we see in newspapers, is that starting to come more into academia as well? Are there aspects of that cross over, or are they two completely different areas still?
People love infographics because they're visual. They're not often the most effective way to communicate information, and it's hard to do them well. So if you really look at an infographic, oftentimes it's not put together very clearly, and even though it's engaging and pretty, it doesn't actually communicate a lot of information. So yes, I see them coming in and people would like to use them because they're visual and engaging. But it's usually a lot harder to make a really effective infographic than it is to communicate the information in a more traditional way. So they can be done well, but they're a lot harder to do.
That's fantastic. Sydney has just posted, yes. So next week, if you're available, Wednesday at 11 a.m., Michelle will be back to give sort of that makeover 101 for your charts, graphs, and tables, and to kind of strip that process down and put things back together. Sydney has put the link for that in our website. If you have other people in your office or other people that you're working with doing research across the university that you think would gain by today's presentation or the one next week, be sure we will be posting this one. We are recording it, and we will be posting it on our SURE YouTube site here as soon as it's ready to go, and I will give the link to our YouTube site. And once I've see that, there's the downside of too many screens, right? Like we want our stuff to be always easy. So I did actually change our YouTube channel yesterday, that you can find it. If you just do Undergraduate Research Initiative, you will also find us in YouTube. So sorry about all the X's and P's and Q's and K's in that link. But yeah, so next week's session is more of a step-by-step guide. Today is that large-scale overview. And I just want to say thank you, Michelle, for offering us your time. Really appreciate it. And Sydney, for bringing your mom on board. That's the advantage of having an amazing student assistant who is related to amazing people. So we really appreciate that. And yeah, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday at 11.
I hope it was helpful. Thank you.
It was really good. There's lots of thank yous coming in on the chat. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.